My talk, or our kind of session here, because I'm not going to be doing a ton of talking, is about Marxist politics. What Marxist politics means changes over time and in different places. Every generation and every people has to decide for themselves what it means to be a radical, a revolutionary, a Marxist, and what the politics of that are. So what lessons you draw from history, what you look around and you see that you don't find in the books and the texts that you're reading, that goes into recreating or creating the political tradition that you see yourselves as part of. So even though being a Marxist, being a radical, being a revolutionary is a creative, creative project, there's still dilemmas of political strategy that confront us today, which are the same ones that have tended to confront revolutionaries and radicals, and Marxists especially, throughout the 20th century. And what we're looking at are kind of very specific ways that U.S. revolutionaries dealt with those problems in the 1930s and the 1940s, mainly the Communist Party. Now, the stuff that you've listened to and read has been pretty sympathetic to the Communist Party during this period. There's lots of interpretations out there which is very critical. And I encourage you to look at those as well. They certainly made a ton of errors, shortcomings, and mistakes, which we can talk about. Ultimately, what you think of the strategies that we discuss is up to you. We're going to start with just a little exercise, a free write or free draw or free think, it's up to you exercise. We're just going to take, I think, 3 minutes to do this. And I just want you to think back to the 2008 recession. You don't have to think about anything that's traumatizing or upsetting. But just think back. It happened. It sent U.S. society into an upheaval, right? And I want you to, free write or free draw. What did you hope would happen in response to that crisis? What did you hope would happen? Or what did you imagine might happen? And then what did you think would actually happen, right? So put yourself back in that moment. What did you hope would happen? How did you think society would respond to this crisis, the Great Recession? And then in the back of your mind, what did you think was actually going to happen? Thinking about what we aspire to and then trying to assess what's going to happen is the basic situation or condition of being a revolutionary in the United States. We have hopes and we have dreams. We kind of really yearn for having to confront practically the problems that Lenin talks about. Oh, what will we do with the state once we control it, right? That would be great to have that problem, right? That's what we want to have. We want to be in the kinds of transformative struggles that Che's talking about, where you start at a certain point and you end up kind of with both transformed human beings and transformed society. But being a materialist is also, in many ways, about trying to have an assessment of the way the situation is and not as we hope or wish it would be. And that's kind of what folks have talked about in different ways here. You look at just putting kind of terms on the things that people talked about, you look at the balance of forces, right? That's kind of almost in some ways one of the most important things to think about when you're assessing how strong is the power of the interests that are being criticized right now, right? How strong is the banking sector's connection with government versus government's incentive to respond to popular pressure? Subjective changes, what you talked about, changes in consciousness and how that might play out, maybe not immediately, but in a few years. Objective situations that change. People are getting thrown out of their houses. More strata, more layers of society are being affected than before. What is that going to mean, right? Looking at the balance of forces, people wanted to have revolutionary aspirations for this period, but I think fundamentally people in some ways acknowledged or saw that we were not in a revolutionary situation. And so that's kind of the nub of a lot of the dilemmas that radicals and revolutionaries face in the United States. We're not in a revolutionary situation. How do we formulate goals and a vision of advancing the struggle, just short of overturning capitalism, right? What's the next stage of the struggle that we're trying to reach that will move us towards our ultimate goals and our ultimate dreams, collective liberation? I asked the question about racism because I think it's one of the ones that has been central to the question of social change in the U.S., the central role of racism as a weapon against all movements for equality. And then tying this together, I would just say that what we're going to be thinking about for the rest of the session is how do we stay realistic about those things that we just talked about, right? Our assessment of the balance of forces, the level of consciousness in society, the openings that we have, however limited they are. How do we stay realistic about that while keeping our hearts on fire, right? How do we do that? So the first thing that we're going to look at is the Al Richmond article, and it wasn't the whole thing, it was just kind of a few pages from it, which looks at the left, the communists, and the Congress of Industrial Organizations. So let me give you some background on it. What Richmond is doing in that whole long chapter is trying to draw lessons from the Chinese and Cuban revolutions in thinking about strategy for U.S. revolutionaries. He's interested in Cuba and China because of the United Front strategies that those revolutionaries had, and because they formulated goals which were not initially revolutionary goals, but which generated a historical dynamic which carried those countries into socialism. Right? So the Cuban Revolution does not start out as a socialist revolution. It transforms very rapidly into a socialist revolution once Batista is overthrown. The Chinese Revolution, the similar thing. So in the Richmond article, he's talking about the first United Front period in China, which was in the mid-1920s. In the early I'm not an expert on this stuff, so I apologize if I get this stuff wrong. So in the early 1920s, China is fragmented. There's into many different territories ruled by so-called warlords. The Kuomintang, or the Nationalist Party, is led by this person, Sun Yat-sen, who's a key kind of nationalist revolutionary figure. He's trying to unite the country and to form a republic and to kind of defeat the warlords. He's being assisted by the Soviet Union. They want to have kind of a stable and ally to their south. He eventually dies in 1925, and he's replaced by Chiang Kai-shek, which is a crucial turn of events. And at the start of this period, the Chinese Communist Party is very small. So in 1923, they have 300 people, right? 1923, they have 300 people. They've got 4 political priorities, which include national reunification, organizing urban workers, improving conditions in the countryside, and expelling foreign imperialists. And they decide, as their overarching goal, to prioritize national reunification, and they decide to work with the KMT, who has this alliance with the Soviet Union, the Kuomintang. They decide to make that alliance in order to achieve that goal. And it pays off. They make important advances. The armies are kind of marching through different parts of China. The Communist Party sends their cadre out in front of the armies to organize the countryside and the rural areas to disrupt society, disrupting kind of warlord control. Then the armies sweep in. They're advancing through the country. They get to Shanghai. The Communist Party sends its cadre out to work with the trade unions. They launch a general strike with 600,000 workers in Shanghai in 1927. At the same time, Chiang Kai-shek has started meeting with the industrialists and shady figures from the underworld of the city. And 4 weeks after the strike, there's a paramilitary attack on the Union. There's a protest in response to that attack the following day. and at the protest, the KMT kills 100 protesters, including many of the Chinese Communist cadre and many of the Unionists. The Communist Party regroups. They try to form an alliance with the left wing of the KMT, and they lead an insurrection in Canton, the Canton Commune. It lasts 2 days, and then they're massacred, just massacred. So the alliance falls apart, right? The KMT has kind of openly betrayed the CCP in the worst possible way. They've actually killed their members. And the CCP is struggling to regain their footing. Japan invades China in the mid-1930s, and the communists then face a question. How do we defeat Japanese imperialism? We're not strong enough to do it on our own. Do we need to form an alliance with the KMT? Right? And imagine trying to think about that decision in the mid-1930s. Japanese imperialists on the one hand, KMT on the other hand. What do? They decide to form the alliance. And they actually make a bunch of compromises and modifications to their political program in order to maintain this alliance. So instead of calling for the expropriation and redistribution of land, they modify that to say we want lower rents in the countryside. That way we don't piss off the kind of land-owning elements which are part of the KMT, and we can kind of maintain this alliance. This time, though, the alliance leads to a different result. And what Richmond is doing is thinking about why, right? And in 1946, after that Japanese is driven out and the KMT turns on the Communist Party, actually the Communist Party drives the KMT out of China, right? Richmond is looking at this as kind of trying to wrestle with what this means for political strategy, and he's then looking at what the left does in the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the union movement in the United States. He criticizes them for following a strategy that mirrors what he sees as the Communist Party strategy during that first United Front when they were massacred, one of being kind of all alliance and no struggle, right? So he says the communists during that first period is the unity of that alliance is their overarching priority. That's the main thing they care about, and they make whatever sacrifices they need for their political independence to maintain that, and that's why they end up getting massacred. So he says the left should have a strategy of both alliance and struggle within this alliance within the CIO. So what I want to do is do a short pair share. Does that make any sense to you? Like, you want to be both in alliance and struggle with the same social force. What does that mean? Like, what does it look like? How would that work? Can you think of any examples from your own personal experience in politics where that might make sense? If you're struggling against somebody, doesn't that make them your enemy? Why would you be in alliance with your enemy, right? So let's just grapple with this kind of issue for a few minutes. I think people generally kind of really appreciated, just from their own personal experiences, that the role of power in these united fronts is really important. When you don't bring anything besides your super radical ideology, right, if you're not able to have an organizational base like that will eventually be respected, it doesn't get you very far. I want to add, though, that there's some points that Richmond makes, which is about united fronts that are slightly different from kind of own personal experiences with alliances. He specifically talks about needing to think about politics that will activate millions, right? And that's kind of the scale that revolutionaries need to think about when thinking about social change in the United States. How do we pull together united fronts and identify intermediate objectives, historical tasks, that will move millions into action? I want to say that kind of this question of power within the groups, there just hasn't been, I think, there's no easy answer to that. I'll give you the formula, which a lot of people who talk about united fronts will tell you, which is that a united front will have left, middle, and right forces, and the task of revolutionaries is to unite the left, win over the middle, and isolate the right. And you can, in your head, you can see how that makes sense. Like, we will strengthen our wing, that will provide an anchor, like that will give us the organizational strength, and also we are always right, so we'll win over the middle, and that will then like weaken the right-wing forces. So that's like the formula, right? In practice, and particularly today when we don't have a left the way that there was in the 30s during the anti-fascist period, it's much harder to envision what even those terms might mean, right? But I think the general point of being in there, figuring out when you're principled in struggle, when you need to make compromises for alliances, but with the goal of ending up stronger than when you started, is kind of the right general guidelines. So the next kind of case that we're going to look at is the National Negro Congress, and give you a little bit of background on this. This is again about the Communist Party, and during the first part of the Great Depression, fascism is starting to become a mass phenomenon. The Communist Party has a strategy which they call class against class. It's also called like the third period. And they see a sharpening, escalating, turbulent struggle between the working class and all of its enemies, because we're in the midst of an economic crisis and all kinds of things are going on, including in the enemies kind of liberals, which they call social fascists, right? Because they're just kind of like fascists, but not. So they're social fascists. Hitler's seizure of power is kind of a wake-up call, right? And so then when that happens, the Comintern then in 1935 says that we need to switch to the Popular Front strategy of uniting as many people as possible against fascism, again, reaching across class lines. They envisioned uniting working class forces, farmers, people of color, the middle class, against fascism and reaction. And just like the Communist Party did, this means they modify their politics a little bit. So in the third period, and prior to the CP, the Communist Party had been really at the cutting edge of thinking about race in the United States in many ways. They developed this kind of Marxist nationalist theory of the Black Belt nation. And they supposedly are foregrounding, demanding self-determination for an independent black nation in the South. During the Popular Front period, this changes, and so they move away from the League of Struggle for Negro Rights. They actually fold that up and focus on the National Negro Congress. They don't put agitating for an independent black nation in the South as their key central demand, and they shift their work towards job discrimination, disfranchisement, and issues that put them into contact and relationship and alliance with a much broader set of forces in the black community. So that's kind of the background for the National Negro Congress. And the National Negro Congress forms around three main points of unity: fighting racial discrimination, supporting industrial unionism, and anti-fascism. And the author of that piece says, you know, the National Negro Congress was one of the most important, most significant organizations during this period, and communists' kind of influence and reach extended far greater than that it had previously. So I think the question for us, and we will do this just in large group among ourselves, did building the National Negro Congress advance the left's goals during this period, or did it divert the left from its goals during this period? And you cannot say it's the dialectical synthesis of both. I will not allow you to say that. Be clear. What happens to the left politics, and also what happens to the centrist politics in these united fronts. And a lot of us come to left politics with the idea and the passion about being a leftist, meaning we're pushing for the most radical demands, the most radical analysis, the most radical ideology, and that's an important part of what it means to be a Marxist. But there's also this other tradition to Marxist politics, which we don't often consider, more concerned about how we put forward politics that unites as many as possible around goals that move the overall struggle forward. And in this particular case, the National Negro Congress focused on three issues that I would say were the most critical issues of the 1930s. Not in a moral sense, right, but in a political sense, the ones that would shape the trajectory of the country. Racism, unionism, fascism, right? And they did it in a way where they tried to unite with the most progressive sentiments of the center, so not the most moderate demands of the center, the most wishy-washy demands, but also not the most advanced demands of the left, the most progressive demands of the center, the most progressive sentiments of the center. That was the basis of the unity for this coalition. That was why they were able to, I think, shape the politics in the particular way that they did. Cool. So, Claudia Jones in 7 minutes. Okay. So, for myself, certainly, when you learn about intersectionality, it starts with the Combahee River Collective and Some of Us Are Brave and these kinds of classic anthologies of the mid-1970s, very important. Don't necessarily, I think so learning about Claudia Jones is often a revelation because it was kind of buried history. So, just some short notes on this. Certainly, intersectional theory and black feminism predates the Communist Party. Many would obviously start the intellectual tradition with Sojourner Truth. And in the 1920s, there's a woman named Elise Johnson McDougald who writes kind of one of the earliest conceptualizations of double oppression in her essay, The Struggle of Negro Women for Sex and Race Emancipation, who says, like women in general, but more particularly like those of other oppressed minorities, the Negro woman has been forced to submit to overpowering conditions. Pressure has been exerted upon her both from without and within her group. So pressure from without and within, racism and sexism, that's for her the double burden of Negro women. But it's during the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, the Communist Party develops kind of this crew of brilliant black women leaders, and in some ways they have their heyday in the late 40s and 50s, because a lot of the male leaders are actually being driven underground, the years of the Smith Act. Anyway, and Claudia Jones obviously is writing these essays in 49. Black women like Louise Thompson, Claudia Jones, Vicki Garvin, Esther Cooper, Dorothy Burnham, who's the mother of Linda Burnham, who's an open local, Charlene Mitchell, who was one of the mentors for Angela Davis. There's just this tremendous burst of theorizing, right? So Ella Baker, who's not in the party, writes, but is in around the party circles, has debates with party people. She's not a communist. She writes The Bronx Slave Market about black women domestic workers in the Bronx who are standing on a street corner and being looked over and evaluated by white housewives in order to be hired for work. Louise Thompson writes about them in 1936 in this article Toward a Brighter Dawn, where she first uses the phrase triple exploitation, saying, over the whole land, Negro women meet this triple exploitation as workers, as women, and as Negroes. So we move from double to triple exploitation. And then obviously we have Claudia Jones. And just to recap some of the stuff from the interview, she moves to New York City at the age of 8. When she's 13, her mom dies, and Jones feels like she's literally worked to death in a sweatshop, in a Harlem sweatshop. In 1948, she gets arrested and threatened with deportation. And it's the next year, right? It's the year after she gets arrested and threatened with deportation that she writes kind of her most powerful and impactful essays on black feminism, An End to the Neglect of the Problems of the Negro Women, and We Seek Full Equality for Women, right? And this tradition kind of gets carried forward by the Sojourners for Truth and Justice, which was founded in 1951. And their first public declaration, a call to Negro women, states, "We will no longer, in sight of God, sit by and watch our lives destroyed by unreasonable and unreasoning hate that metes out to us every kind of death it is possible for a human being to die." Which to me is that phrase, the hate that metes out to us every kind of death it is possible for a human being to die, is to me still the most vivid and intense explanation of what triple exploitation means. So that group includes communists, but also non-communist radicals. They work on freeing a widowed African-American sharecropper who killed a white man attempting to rape her. And then this is the tradition that gets taken up by Fran Beal in Double Jeopardy and the Third World Women's Alliance, and then Combahee, right? And Combahee obviously making the tremendous leap forward of talking about heterosexism in relationship to all these other oppressions. So let me wrap up just by saying that, you know, every generation is confronted with historic political tasks, right? Regardless of the day-to-day work that we do, we also have kind of historic political tasks that we feel the weight of. And ours, in my opinion, is constructing the alliances and social forces at the scale and scope necessary to defeat the racist right wing in an age where the left is weaker than it's been in a century. Every generation inspires itself with new visions of liberation and emancipation like the ones that Claudia Jones developed, and fuels itself with righteous impatience and urgency. How do we handle both of these things together? So we've looked at how previous generations have sought to do this, how they imagined the steps and the goals that moved them towards their dreams, but it's up to us to answer the question for ourselves.